yeah, so the topic is broadly related to insights from economics, but very specifically applied to renewable energy, renewable electricity, and also specifically to developing countries. So, and what I'm going to talk about here comes directly from my research, where I started wondering what kind of institutions and policies should we build to be able to integrate renewables in developing countries, and whether the kind of insights that were well known in the developed world were in fact applicable to developing country contexts. So I hope that you find this talk interesting, because I think as we all come from developing countries, there is some shared context, and which may not be applicable, or are certainly not applicable in much of the developed world. So I hope that you find this interesting and useful. Let me start sharing my screen. Right. So as we all know, currently renewable energy is, especially solar and wind, renewable electricity is amongst the cheapest forms of electricity in LCOE terms, in terms of the cost of electricity, least cost of electricity per unit produced. And that is not the only reason to invest in renewables. It's also environmentally friendly and important in order to reduce carbon emissions, because energy systems contribute to about 70% of our emissions. Now, if we want renewable electricity to be adopted at a large scale in the developing world, which accounts for a large share of the energy production of the world and is increasing at a faster pace, the energy demand is increasing at a much faster pace than the developed world, we need to address some problems associated with renewable electricity. And one of the main problems associated with renewable electricity is its intermittency, is its variability. So we can't tell when renewable production, we can't tell renewable solar energy to be produced whenever we want it, whether it's in the night or at different times. It depends on the weather factors, climatic conditions, seasons, and many other factors. So what implications does that have? And if we still want to integrate renewables, how can we do it in an efficient way? So over the world today, many developing countries have strong targets for investing in renewable energy capacity. So India has or had until a few weeks a target for 450 gigawatts of renewables by 2030. China has a target of 35% of electricity from renewable energy by 2030. And I read a report where Latin America announced her target of 70% renewable energy by 2030. Now, if we want to integrate renewables, mainly solar and wind, so intermittent renewables, we will face challenges in terms of integrating such renewables as the share of generation from renewable electricity increases from between 50% as the share of energy from renewables increases to around 50% of the total energy produced in the system, the intermittency starts to pose a real problem, meaning that more electricity will be generated at a time when demand is lesser than the electricity produced at that time. So unless you're able to balance that electricity, whether either through time, through storage, or in space, by sending it to another location where there is maybe higher demand, the renewable energy will have to start being curtailed at the source, will have to be cut off, turned off at the source itself. So this is a problem that we will need to address across the world as the share of renewables increases in the generation portfolio. But in most of the developing world, like in India also, a large part of the power, most of the power is traded through long-term contracts. And when long-term contracts exist, often they have a component which says that we need this much energy at this time, and from a certain particular plant to a particular from a particular generation plant to a particular consumer. Now, when you have such contracts which are very specific between who's buying and who's selling and exactly how much energy, what it does is it reduces options to balance renewable energy, balance the intermittency. So long-term contracts have they force certain buyers and certain sellers to produce at particular points in time. Instead, maybe you can have an arrangement like maybe a wholesale spot market or other such arrangements, whereby large groups of buyers and sellers can buy from an open market. In terms of renewable energy in particular, these long-term contracts actually limit the options for balancing renewable energy production. And other issues that are common in India and China, for instance, are that local governments have incentives which again want to push their own power plants forward, or they want to support their own power plants because of their local contexts. So, however, if we want to integrate renewable energy, we want trade to be spread as much across a geographical area as possible. Now, most policymakers across Europe and the US and wherever, the China, India, and most other places, scholars recommend introducing markets to enable better renewable energy integration. So, for instance, in China in 2015, their highest policymaking body, the State Council, proposed market reforms partly aimed at prioritizing renewable integration. In India, the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission proposed an entirely redesigning of the electricity market to change it from the existing contract-based system, long-term contract-based system, to a more dynamic market-based system. And in the EU, they have liberalized their electricity markets more than 20 years ago, and they continue to deepen and strengthen markets in their system. And one study estimates the savings of about 40 billion euros by further integrating markets. And those sort of estimates exist for both China, India, and other countries as well, where you actually have a lot of savings by allowing trade of electricity across large regions and between larger pools of buyers and sellers. Now, however, even though there is a push from policymakers and scholars to recommend markets, very few developing countries have fully liberalized electricity markets. So, can you raise your hand if you don't have a fully liberalized electricity market in your country? Abera, how are things in Ethiopia? And I see that Tanun is also clapping. Right. So Lanka says yes. Okay. Which country are you from, Lanka?
Sri Lanka.
Oh, Sri Lanka. I see. Okay. Great. I didn't want to make the assumption that you were from there. Okay, great. But have you started the liberalization process in your countries? Lanka.
Yeah, in Sri Lanka, we don't have an open electricity market. We have a central. I'm from Ceylon Electricity Board, and I think Dilini is also from Ceylon Electricity Board.
Oh, great.
So yeah, so we have a single major utility is the Ceylon Electricity Board, and we are responsible for major portion of generation and the whole transmission and major portion of distribution.
I
And
see.
transmission plays the single plays as the single buyer for
Right.
all the generation, and
I see.
we distribute via the distribution
Okay.
division. So
I understand.
it's a closed situation there. It's
And is
not
there
an
competition between the generators?
not competition. Major portion of the generation is owned by CEB,
I see. I see.
and there are private
Players.
power producers,
I see.
and not competition among the.
I see. Okay.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
So in our country also, it's the same with Sri Lanka, but as you know, we are trying to generate from renewable energy like wind and solar.
Yeah.
So that is also connected to the grid. So from the central board, we are getting electricity. No competition, no other market is there.
I see. So they are they are a vertically integrated, regulated entity. So are the generation companies also owned by the same company as the transmission and distribution?
Yeah. The government owns this wind and other source.
Right, right. Yeah, so a lot of us are in the same situation. In India, the situation is that there like in Sri Lanka, private producers also exist and they can sell, but and there is a single buyer entity who can procure from a variety of producers, including the government producer as well. So we're all in a similar situation. And in some, and of course, within India, it again differs from state to state. Some states are more vertically integrated, some states are less. So stepping back from markets for renewables, the idea of market reform comes from, again, in implementing economic concepts into a large scale infrastructure system, right? So implementing the idea that you can have greater efficiency of a more efficient outcome for the system if there is competition between buyers and sellers. If you create a market, you can have a greater efficient outcome. And so instead of having one company which owns generation, transmission, and distribution, which then becomes a monopoly, it's only one company who has the power to buy and sell, who has the power to sell, and there's no competition for that company. So there is a real possibility that they charge way too much to the consumer, because they would be a monopoly. So you want to try and reduce the chances of that happening. And so the idea of liberalization came about, where the recommendation was that you introduce competition into the sector. And how do you introduce competition into the sector? By these 7 steps. So you, instead of having a state-owned entity, you have you privatize functions like generation, maybe distribution, retail, also transmission, and the network aspects are natural monopolies. So they cannot, by nature, by virtue of their technology, they are not susceptible to competition. So you can't have multiple transmission lines, right? It doesn't make sense to have multiple transmission lines competing with each other, because it just does not make sense. The transmission network operations are not susceptible to competition. So we regulate those, but the other aspect, so either the retail aspect or the generation aspect, let's try and infuse competition into those parts which are susceptible to competition. That was the idea behind liberalizing the electricity sector. And this became very popular in the 90s and 2000s. And it was started, or it began becoming stronger and stronger in the 1980s, in the Thatcher and Reagan governments, where it began to be adopted by a lot of these Western countries, and some places like Chile as well. And then in the 90s and 2000s, it started being pushed to some extent by the World Bank and other organizations to developing countries, in order to improve efficiency through competition in the electricity sector. So coming back to the steps of how to liberalize, first, change ownership to the segments of the electricity system which are susceptible to competition. Unbundling, vertical separation. So this means that here separate out generation, transmission, distribution, and even retail. Retail is one block I haven't added here, which just means somebody to actually procure power at a large scale and sell it to individual consumers. So you don't take care of the networks or any such, you're just a retailer who buys wholesale electricity and sells it to smaller consumers. Horizontal restructuring of generation. So first, vertically break up generation, transmission, distribution. Then horizontal restructuring means break up generation companies, so you can infuse competition between generation companies. For instance, if a single buyer wants to buy from ideally, a single buyer should have the opportunity to buy from multiple players, so that they have the opportunity to choose from the cheapest one. And conversely, between the multiple players, they will naturally be incentivized to offer the cheapest cost electricity, because they would want to get into a contract with the buyer. So that was the idea with the idea of horizontal restructuring of generation. Horizontal integration of network operations. So if there are multiple utilities which have multiple transmission networks, not in the same area but across a large area, integrate only the network aspects. So then transmission, put all the different transmission system operators, integrate them into one entity, which then allows more competition between the buyers on the one hand and the sellers on the other. Independent regulatory agencies. So we also discussed that the network parts of the electricity system are natural monopolies, and they need to be regulated. So for those regulated entities, we want some entity who is independent, a regulator who can actually independently value the cost of that network and then charge it fairly to the consumers. and voluntary public wholesale spot energy market. So now once you've separated ownership, you've separated the buyers and the sellers, and made the access to network open to all the buyers and sellers, then you need a mechanism which allows the buyers and sellers actually do the trade. So there you can have multiple mechanisms. As you can see here, you can have bilateral contracts, you can have spot markets or day ahead markets like you have in Europe, intraday balancing markets, and things like that. So market mechanisms, and create responsive demand side institutions. So not just do you want the response to show up on the generation side, which is, whenever there is electricity demand, depending on that, different producers generate. You also want, based on the price that shows up from the demand and supply meeting, you have the price. If the price is high, the costlier generators will come in and generate. But conversely, you can also have a demand which responds to the high price and say, okay, because the price is very high now, I'm going to reduce my demand or change my demand depending on how the price is. And the reason this helps is it you're actually creating a system where the value of the electricity is transparent and evident to all participants. So it allows informed decisions both on the buyer side and the seller side. Now, if there is very high demand at a certain point in time, but low supply, let's say the renewable energy is not generating at that point in time, then the market can provide by virtue of providing a high price signal at that point, it can change potentially the behavior of a consumer and to consume later when the price is not so high. So what they're doing is actually somehow helping balance the system at a lower cost. If the market price is transparent and open, it can provide a strong signal for behavior on both sides. Right, and another point or another rationale behind creating a market for electricity or for any commodity is that because you have a price, assuming that you have close to perfect market conditions or good enough competition to have market conditions, the price should give you a signal for how much you want to invest also. So instead of making assumptions about how much energy or how much capacity to invest in, instead of making assumptions about that, the price can actually give you a good signal about how much power is necessary. So if the price is really high, then as somebody making an investment, you can think into electricity generation power, you can say, okay, because the price is high, there is a need for more supply in the market. And so I will invest to the extent to which I can recover my investment because the price is high, right? So automatically the price gives you an efficient information signal for how much to invest in. Of course, it is not perfect. And, there are lots of questions about how prices might change in the future, how volatile they are, but they're also helpful to some extent. For instance, they can tell you when a shortage is happening or when, the pattern of maybe some regions need more investment and other regions don't need more investment. So those sort of things. Price also gives you a signal for efficient investment in an ideal world. So it's based on this idea that the liberalization was introduced. So basically infuse more efficiency. But not only does it have efficiency implications, it also has renewable integration implications by, as I will explain here. So for renewables, because of its very intermittent nature and uncertain nature, unbundling, or the idea of having an independent transmission network, is actually extremely important, because the network provides a means for balancing renewable energy. So so for instance, there are lots of cases where in non-liberalized settings in certain parts of India, for instance, we had cases where the transmission network operator did not allow renewable energy producers to produce at a certain time because they thought it was a risk to the system. And so this is actually a case of, one could argue that this is a case of biased use of the network, because the idea of risk, it's arguable. The network should be able to accept energy from different sources if it is managed well. But if that network operator has also the incentives of running their own generator, then they might want to push their own generator forward and not allow renewables generate. So unless they also own renewables as well, which could or might not happen. So the idea is that the network should be as independent or unbiased as possible to allow everybody, even renewable energy, an equal chance at buying and selling. So for instance, this is important because as soon as maybe renewables increases or decreases in an unpredictable fashion, you need the network, maybe a different generator can rise to the challenge, or maybe the demand can reduce at a certain other spot. So the network allows all of that to happen. And so it is important that the network is unbiased in its operation. The other reason that liberalized markets could help the integration of renewables is the presence of a wholesale market. Now, with renewables, what a market signal, just by virtue of setting up a market, automatically only the producers whose cost of production is lower than that of the market price will have the incentive to produce. So then renewable energy automatically gets first preference because it has zero marginal costs. Fuel costs are zero, so it gets first preference in a wholesale market where marginal prices are what drive operation. Now, that is one reason. So you, by virtue of having a market, renewables automatically have get a higher preference because their marginal costs are lower. The other reason is it is hard to know without markets where you might want power plants which can balance the flexibility of balance the intermittency of renewables. So if you have market, so for instance, if you have price signals which are differentiated by location, so let's say in a certain location you have much more volatility or much higher prices, maybe because they have lesser generation there, they have lesser whatever reason, they have very high prices, or they have very high volatility in renewables, and that volatility in generation of renewables is making them curtail renewables, then the market is giving you a signal where it is telling you at that location you might want to invest in some resources for flexibility. So by flexibility, I mean either flexible power plants like gas, or in some cases coal plants, or storage, or demand response. So whatever, it could be but it gives you a signal that certain locations need more flexibility because of renewables. And so it gives you a sense of where investments can be appropriately made in the presence of renewables. And finally, the idea of creating demand side response is important, as I explained earlier, because it helps manage the intermittency of renewables if the signals are strong enough and the consumers are actually responsive to those signals. Research shows that industrial consumers are responsive to price signals, so they can actually help manage the intermittency of renewables. But domestic consumers aren't. So for these reasons, there is value in implementing a liberalized setup to some extent in order to integrate renewables. However, have developing countries adopted the liberalized market? And as we found out from just a brief conversation with some of our participants in this room, very, very few countries have actually adopted a fully liberalized electricity market. Most countries have these aspects, so liberalization law, corporatization, an independent regulator, independent generators, but very few countries, only 30%, have implemented unbundling, wholesale markets, or retail competition. And these are all aspects that I argued are important for renewable energy integration. Now, for an island country like Sri Lanka, this might not apply as much unless it were connected. I think it is less applicable to the extent that, or it is the value of liberalization to an island country is as applicable as there are a number of different sources for generation. So if the more decentralized renewables you have, it is likely that this sort of a setup will help you manage it more efficiently. But if generation remains somewhat centralized and there's not enough generators to create competition, then perhaps this is not the best setup for you. Perhaps regulation itself is sufficient. But across most developing countries, these institutions which are supposed to help integrating renewables don't exist. So why is that, and what problems could that pose, and what can we do about it? Now, a little bit more about the technical issues for integrating renewable energy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if we want to integrate more and more renewable energy, we need more flexibility in the system. So the system should be able to balance the variability and uncertainty of renewables in a cost-effective way. And this can be done technically through either flexible generation, like I said, storage, demand response, or just the presence of greater interconnection, right? Just as an example of how important this is, in 2030, one study estimates that in India, more than 40% of the total electricity transactions that take place in India needs to cross state borders. Now, this is a problem because in India, most transactions are organized within the states and are sort of they're island operations within states, right? They're not integrated between states. So, and for historical reasons and for many other reasons, but with renewables, it needs, the more renewables we have, the more important it will be to have the system both economically and technologically integrated across state borders too. For this reason, so for at least 40% of the power will need to cross state borders to allow renewable energy be absorbed by the system in 2030. Now, so when I, try to reconcile, okay, we don't have these institutions in developing countries, but we might need those institutions. We are likely to need those institutions when we have more renewables. I asked, okay, why do we have this situation where these institutions which we need for integrating renewables don't exist in developing countries, right? And based on those insights, I thought about how that understanding could help us inform designing better institutions for the integration of renewables in developing countries. And so I went through a lot of literature, and I came up with some framework where I identified the core differences between developing country contexts and developed country contexts. Under what context was liberalization introduced in each of these sets of countries? So in the developed countries, electrification or access rates were 100%. In developing countries, it was it remains quite low even now. Inequality exists and it is increasing in developed countries. But inequality in the developing world, sorry, Delaney, yeah, thank you. Inequality in the developing world is far higher, and there is far more poverty in the developing world. Correspondingly, redistributive pressures, so the pressure for uplifting wealth or welfare, uplifting the poor, and allowing them energy access, even if they can't afford it. So in one sense, redistributing welfare from the rich to the poor to some extent, that pressure to do that is much, much higher in the developing world. Financial viability of utilities is hardly a problem in the developed world. However, cost recovery from consumers, only from consumers, not from state subsidies or taxpayers, but only from people who are actually using that electricity, that remains unviable in most developing countries. Regulatory capacity in the developed world, so I think I've got this wrong here. This needs to be these two ideas needs to be switched. So regulatory capacity in the developed context, the focus of regulators is to monitor market power. Is there a monopoly? Is there not? Is there somebody unfairly exercising market power? But in the developing context, regulatory functions are very political because they involve ideas of, okay, who should get a subsidy, who is deserving population, who can we charge higher, who can we charge lower, how do we manage the cost of electricity while providing access to as many people as possible. And so this is just to give you a sense of how the contexts are so different, and therefore the knowledge coming out of one context or the ideas and designs coming out of one context may not be applicable entirely to a different context. Governance indicators. So in the developed world, a World Bank report talks about how governance indicators are actually really high. So they perform very well in terms of rule of law, control of corruption, and government effectiveness. But in the developing countries, all of these indicators for governance get a very low rank. So they don't do very well in terms of governance. Now, given that these differences in context exist between the developing world and the developed world, what did the idea of power sector reform or liberalization of the power sector achieve? What were the objectives of these of power sector reform in the developed world and the developing world, and what were the outcomes of power sector reform in these two contexts? So, in the developed context, in the rich countries, the objectives of reform were improve efficiency, lower price, increase consumer choice, and recently integration of renewables. The outcomes of reform, well, there was a limited increase in efficiency, and but there was also a reduced incentive to invest when the invest meaning large investments in the power sector when the prices were very uncertain or very volatile. So those were some outcomes of the reforms. So there was some efficiency, but not much. And there was also, they realized that investment signals need to be different or stronger. In the developing context, what were the objectives of reform? They were, so power sector reform was introduced in the context of massive shortage of supply. So private sector investment was one main objective of reform. Increasing access and reliability was another. Cost recovery for loss-making utilities was another, and reduce the burden on the government. Now you see how the objectives of reform itself were very different between the developed and developing countries. And let's look at the outcomes now. In the developing countries, again, there was a slight increase in efficiency, but in many countries, the electricity prices actually increased because it turned out that governments were subsidizing electricity in a large number of cases. And so when reforms were introduced, the actual price of electricity began to be reflected. So prices actually increased in many cases. And private sector participation came about, but there was this was also a mixed outcome. In some cases, there was a lot of private sector participation, in others, limited. There was almost no impact on cost recovery. So loss-making utilities continued to make losses. No impact on increasing access or reducing poverty. And investment risk remains an issue, even with power sector reform. So again, let's be reminded that developing country and developed country contexts were very different, but the same institutions were used to resolve somewhat different objectives, and the outcomes then were also very different. Let's look at the socio-political perspectives on objectives and outcomes of reform. So what I showed you earlier was mainly from an economic perspective. Did the reforms actually achieve what they set out to? From a social and political perspective, what did the reforms achieve? And what were they meant to do? Objectives of reform in the developed countries were, sort of from a social perspective, they were driven by a government ideology. They were a political project of the right-leaning governments. In the developing world, socio-political studies talk about how we in developing world introduced power sector reform thanks to institutional emulation. So when for instance, the World Bank, or when other countries started implementing reforms, developing countries were also sometimes required to implement reforms due to pressures from external financial institutions like the World Bank, IMF, etc. However, when you think about the social and political outcomes of reform, it wasn't necessarily as great as was expected. So market power and social unrest were some things that emerged when under highly deregulated or highly liberalized markets like in California and Norway, where prices just shot up at certain points and there was massive social unrest. Energy poverty is increasingly a politically salient issue in the developed world. But in the developing world, it's there are some useful outcomes. So there has been increased private sector participation. There has been increased competition. So in all countries which have introduced power sector reform, competition between generators is something that has never been reversed. So most people see value in introducing competition amongst generation. But the massive issues that were not, dealt with in the liberalization blueprint was the redistributional issues. How do you manage access issues? How do you manage subsidy issues? How do you manage affordability issues? And that being so different across very different consumer groups. And so the regulator had to play a very different role of redistribution in the developing context rather than when compared to the developed context. What does all this mean for renewable energy integration? Now, we spoke about how, one of the main things that hasn't improved in the developing world, despite cost recovery, despite power sector reform, is the cost recovery issue, is the redistribution issue. Distribution utilities across most developing regions are still not, they still rely on subsidies. So what does this mean for the integration of renewables, right? Can we introduce market-based institutions, which we have agreed or discussed as being important, in this context where cost recovery is a problem? So we, on the one hand, we want market-based institutions to integrate renewables, but on the other, can we do it in this context where cost recovery is a massive problem? And let's look at some examples of the attempts to introduce market-based institutions to integrate renewables in India and China. In India, wholesale markets account for a mere 4% of the total volume transacted. And a proposal was introduced for a nationwide market-based dispatch, which would break the silos that electricity sectors operate in the states, and break it and make it a national system, which would help integration of renewables. But such proposals have not taken off, and they cannot take off unless the working capital issues, that is the DISCOM financial viability issues, are resolved to some extent. Also, there's another issue of centralization of dispatch. It means that there is a loss of autonomy for the local governments. And that has also been, because electricity is such an important public good, local governments want to keep control of delivering and building infrastructure in that sector. So that is another issue which has arisen as a potential obstacle that needs to, for a more efficient and integrated dispatch system, which would help integrate renewables in India. In China, again, similar situation. Pilots for regional markets have failed. So there hasn't been an attempt to make it a countrywide spot market, but regional markets. Even if small regions are put together and have the proposal to introduce a market there, even those pilots have failed, again, for similar reasons. The state governments opposed it because there was a loss of autonomy. And if the markets are required to pass on the actual price of electricity to the consumer, that doesn't fly in places where the consumers can't afford to pay. So again, cost recovery issues, very similar to the Indian context. So let's go back to, the relevance of this liberalization model to integrating renewables. We discussed that unbundling was important to manage renewables. We discussed wholesale markets were important to both create the right incentives for operation and for investment in flexible resources. And finally, we also discussed how demand response actually passing prices to the consumers can help manage intermittency as well. And these are all aspects of the liberalization that could help integrate renewables. But we know that cost recovery is a problem. So what do we need to do? Which is not sufficiently acknowledged in the literature from the West. It is that even in order to unbundle the system, even in order to separate out retail from retail and distribution from generation or transmission, to some extent, you need to some sort of social and political understanding that that it is okay, or to understanding for how much subsidies can be given. You know, how do you make it transparent? Who is going to give this subsidy? You need a space for that conversation. If you don't have the space for that conversation, it is easy to just have one institution which does everything. So the generation, the distribution and transmission, it's easy to have that because you don't, it is easier to cover up, or in some senses make the system more inefficient by creating monopolies where they don't need to be created. So if you want to break monopolies, you need a system which promotes transparency, and for that you need a state government which is okay with a regulator, and they're okay to say, okay, this much is the subsidy and I will pay the subsidy, this much is not the subsidy, or somebody who independently sets tariffs and those sort of things. So managing cost recovery is at the heart of making a successful unbundling operation. Then, if you want to introduce wholesale markets, you need to give enough working capital for the single buyers. So the distribution utilities or the transmission utility, whoever is the single buyer, they need to have sufficient working capital to be able to actually participate in wholesale markets, which need payments on a real-time basis. And these distribution utilities, either they're almost always cash strapped. So how do you manage that cash flow issue, either centrally or at a state level, if you want to incorporate a more efficient dispatch, market-based dispatch mechanism? And even if you don't do it fully, even if you increase the transactions through markets to market-based dispatch to 30% to 40% and give enough working capital just for that, even that will help integrate renewables better than a zero working capital. Management of distributive pressures and designing a retail tariff needs to be balanced against demand response needs. So the core idea for demand response, like I mentioned, so if the correct value of electricity is reflected at a granular space and time to the consumer, then you allow him the information or her the information to respond and do that price signal. But this also implies that can we pass on price signals which might be volatile and which might change to consumers who can't afford to pay for electricity? And the answer is not when electricity is a basic public good. So it is important in the developing context to identify clearly which consumers can we pass on real-time prices to, and which consumers we can't pass on real-time prices to. And this is not a technical issue, but a more political issue. It can be done partly by the regulators. It is usually done by state governments, or so it's a combination of people, participants in this, actors in the system, who can identify how to make sure that the demand response signals go to those participants who actually can afford to participate in the demand response signals without affecting the ability of the poor and vulnerable populations to avail of electricity. Finally, investment needs and risks are both higher in the developing country context. So pure market-based signals are not likely to work to design a system which can efficiently incentivize investments. But we need to identify systems which can both incentivize investment and manage the risk of those investments in an efficient way. Capacity markets might be one way of doing that. Long-term contracts which don't impose physical constraints on the transactions, but only hedge, fixed costs of the transactions. They are another possible way of managing investment. So these are some design principles one could rely on in order to design an institutional setup which is for a developing country context, which can also integrate renewables at scale. So that is all I had to say. I'm open to any questions or comments from you. Any questions, anyone?
Yeah, so if I may.
Yes, please go ahead.
Sure, thanks. Very lovely presentation and pretty insightful on numerous levels. As you mentioned, your analysis on the economic perspective reforms, something I'm relating to. I think the majority of countries in the sub-African region undergoing a lot of reforms, but the basis on which is mostly the objective is building private sector investments, which is quite different from the perspectives of developed countries as you analyze. So it's something I'd like to look at again and again and again. I think when you share the slides, you'll be able to do that.
Yeah.
So also my question now, greater interconnections. You mentioned that in different terms. I'd like to find out from developed countries, greater connection, is it equivalent to smart grid connections? And if that's the case, how was the transition from ordinary grid connections, transmission in this case, to currently smart grids? I say that in many regions in sub-Africa, I think the major problem to integrate renewables is that the interconnection grids are more or less absolute, and they can only take so much amount of renewables. So to accommodate extra amount of renewable, we need smart grids, and that's what I'm trying to refer to. That's what you also meant as greater interconnectors or interconnections. So in summary, my question is, what's been the experience of developed countries in transitioning from ordinary grids to smart grids?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. First of all, thank you for your comments. I think a lot of knowledge is generated in the West and in developed country contexts. And so they sometimes don't account for developing contexts sufficiently. And so we need to come up with such analysis ourselves. So that way, I'm very happy to be presenting this work to this audience in particular. As for your question on smart grids versus greater interconnection, so I think the definition of smart grids is still very is rather amorphous. I think different people use it for different contexts. The way I have understood smart grids is that it is more applicable in regions where there is more decentralized generation. So here in my talk, I was mainly referring to utility scale generation, not sort of off-grid, small scale, decentralized generation. And what smart grids allow you to do is they have, in my understanding, is that you have systems which are responsive to changes in other parts of the system automatically, right? So anything which allows that. So for instance, if a smart home is a home which can maybe know what the electricity price is as at that instant, and then decide which appliances to turn off or turn on. And the same thing at a more systemic level would be a smart grid, right? You have individual locations or individual sort of firms or households should be able to respond to what is happening at other parts of the grid almost automatically. So it would involve sensors, it would involve decision-making algorithms, it might involve aggregator big kind of behavior also, where a large number of individual producers or consumers are aggregated, and there's some algorithm which helps decide whose demand is met to what extent under certain generation conditions, or how much storage is used and things like that. But I don't. So the more decentralized small scale generation you have, I think this will become more important. Again, the problem will be in the developing country context, will be, to which consumers can we show the, can we allow them to be exposed to the prices in a fair way, or not. To what extent do you want to incorporate smartness without exposing or disadvantaging the vulnerable? So that would be the question. But I think, like, what I meant by interconnection was just more transmission lines, more utility scale network infrastructure, which can not at the distribution level, but at the transmission level, which can actually help at a utility scale balance out renewable intermittency. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you so much for your question. And I'm happy to take any other questions, although I know we're past time. So if there's time, and if Professor Priyanka can guide us on, over to you, Priyanka. If there's, I'll let you.
Maybe last one, if I may. Just a quick
sounds
one.
good. Yeah.
Okay.
Energy poverty. How do you define that energy poverty, especially in maybe give practical examples in China, maybe Singapore, India, and Europe?
Yeah, it's so, in our countries, we've always been poor, right? So energy poverty is not, it's like a given, it's like understood. We don't talk about it as a separate concept, but energy poverty is becoming in academia and in politics also a more important concept in the West, because there is growing inequality in the West, and there are more people who are not able to afford electricity or energy, whether it's for heating or any other purposes. So I guess the definition there would be, how much can you, energy poverty is a state where you're not able to afford the energy you need for your basic services. So I think that would be a definition. I don't have a perfect definition of now, but this is mine.
That will suffice. Yeah, I understand now. Thanks.
Yeah. Adeyemi, Adele. Sorry,
Yeah. Please, Yes, I have a question. My question is a little bit talking about the technical aspect. Here in Nigeria, we do the government exploit more of hydro, wind, and lesser exploitation of solar photovoltaic system to the grid. And I think basically it's because of the cost of installation, because of the different voltage level that comprises the grid. So from your own, maybe within your own context in your country, which aspects of voltage level do the government integrate much more of a solar photovoltaic system?
Which aspects of what does the government integrate?
Which level of, in terms of generation, transmission, and distribution, we have the different voltage levels. Like here in Nigeria, we generate and transmit, we generate at lower voltage, transmit at higher voltage. And the voltage is being stepped
levels.
down. Yes,
right. Yeah. So,
Kaveri, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. I think the question is a bit technical part of it. So there is a session planned day after tomorrow, next Monday. We have an entire session which talks about this integration, distribution, technical part of it. So there is an entire day dedicated to this electrical synchronization, efficiencies at which all these renewable can be put into the grid and where it is more efficient. In technically, I'm talking strictly in terms of technical aspect of it. So if the question is technical, I would rather request that please park it till Monday. And we have a very eminent speaker coming and talking about it.
Right. But to answer your question very quickly, utility scale is sent directly to the transmission lines at higher voltage levels, and non-utility scale, so smaller decentralized off-grid or low-scale systems, so home solar systems, those sort of things are at the distribution level. And right now, costs are viable only at the utility scale, so at the transmission level scale. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mark.
All right, so over to you, Priyanka. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Kaveri. The very fact that your session was scheduled toward the end of the day and still we are receiving so much of queries speaks for itself. Thank you for engaging with us and for a wonderful talk that you have presented. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. The day is over for today and we will come back again tomorrow morning at 9:30 India time. Please see to your watches what's your time zone and have a wonderful evening.
Right. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to email me. You can find my email online. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Very much,
Thank you.